Dr. Elena Rossi had spent her entire life surrounded by masterpieces, but she had never owned one. At 45, she was considered one of the world's foremost experts on Vincent van Gogh, with a PhD in art history from the Sorbonne and 20 years of experience as the Senior Curator of European Paintings at the prestigious Whitmore Museum in New York City. She could identify a Van Gogh brushstroke from across a room, detect the subtle differences between authentic works and even the most sophisticated forgeries, and had written 3 definitive books on the artist's techniques and materials. But Elena harbored a secret that would have shocked the art world. She was also one of the most skilled art forgers alive, capable of creating reproductions so perfect that they could fool even the most advanced authentication technologies. This dual identity had been born out of necessity during her graduate studies, when she had discovered that her ability to understand and replicate the techniques of the masters was far more valuable than her academic credentials. Elena's journey into forgery had begun innocently enough. As a struggling graduate student in Paris, she had supplemented her income by creating study copies of famous paintings for wealthy collectors who wanted museum-quality reproductions for their homes. Her work was so exceptional that word spread through exclusive circles, and soon she was earning more from her reproductions than most professors made from their salaries. The transition from legal reproduction to criminal forgery had been gradual, and, in Elena's mind, justified by the corruption and elitism she witnessed in the art world. She had watched as wealthy collectors manipulated auction prices, museums covered up questionable acquisitions, and authentic masterpieces disappeared into private collections, where they would never be seen by the public again. Elena's specialty was Van Gogh, an artist whose techniques she had studied so intensively that she could replicate not just his brush strokes and color choices, but even the chemical composition of his paints and the aging patterns of his canvases. She had spent years analyzing Van Gogh's works, using advanced spectroscopic techniques, studying the molecular structure of his pigments, and even traveling to the quarries where he had obtained his materials. The Whitmore Museum's crown jewel was the Starry Night over the Rhône, one of Van Gogh's most famous works, valued at over $100 million. The painting had been acquired by the museum's founder in 1923 and had been on continuous display for nearly a century, drawing millions of visitors who came specifically to see this masterpiece. Elena had been studying the painting for years, ostensibly as part of her curatorial duties, but actually as preparation for the most audacious art theft in history. She had analyzed every square millimeter of the canvas, documented every brushstroke, and even secretly obtained microscopic samples of the paint during routine conservation work. What made Elena's plan so revolutionary was that she wasn't planning to simply steal the Van Gogh. She was going to replace it with a forgery so perfect that the theft might never be discovered. If successful, she would own one of the world's most valuable paintings, while the museum continued to display what they believed was the original. The technical challenges were enormous. Modern museums employed sophisticated security systems that monitored not just physical access to artworks, but also environmental conditions, vibrations, and even the chemical signatures of the paintings themselves. The Whitmore Museum's security system could detect if a painting had been moved even a few millimeters, and advanced sensors monitored the molecular composition of the air around each artwork to identify any changes in the painting's chemical emissions. Elena's solution was to create not just a visual replica, but a complete molecular duplicate of the original painting. She had spent 3 years developing new techniques for aging pigments, creating authentic canvas materials, and even replicating the specific types of damage and restoration that the 100 original had undergone over the past 135 years. The forgery process had required Elena to become an expert in chemistry, materials, science, and even forensic analysis. She had learned to create pigments using the same mineral sources that Van Gogh had used, to age canvas using controlled exposure to specific types of light and atmospheric conditions, and to replicate the exact patterns of cracking and fading that occurred naturally over time. Most challenging of all, Elena had to create a painting that would not only look identical to the original, but would also produce the same results when subjected to X-ray analysis, infrared spectroscopy, and carbon dating. This required her to understand not just how Van Gogh had painted the visible surface of the work, but also the underlying layers of paint, the preparatory sketches, and even the specific type of wood used in the frame. Elena's workshop was hidden in the basement of her brownstone apartment, equipped with laboratory-grade equipment that would have been the envy of any major museum's conservation department. She had spectrometers for analyzing paint composition, controlled atmosphere chambers for aging materials, and even a small particle accelerator for carbon dating her work to ensure it would pass scientific authentication. The creation of the replica had taken Elena 2 years of painstaking work. Every brushstroke had to be perfect, not just in appearance but in the specific way the paint had been applied, the pressure Van Gogh had used, and even the emotional state he had been in when creating each section of the painting. Elena had studied Van Gogh's letters and diary entries from the period when he painted the Starry Night over the Rhône, understanding not just his artistic techniques but his psychological state, his physical condition, and even the specific weather conditions. On the nights when he worked on the painting, this psychological understanding was crucial because Van Gogh's brushstrokes were deeply connected to his emotional state, and replicating them required Elena to essentially channel the artist's mindset. The most difficult aspect of the forgery was replicating Van Gogh's unique impasto technique, the thick application of paint that created the three-dimensional texture that was characteristic of his work. Elena had to understand not just how the paint looked, but how it felt, how it caught light, and how it had changed over time as the oils oxidized and the canvas shifted. Elena's plan for the actual theft was as sophisticated as her forgery techniques. As senior curator, she had legitimate access to the painting for routine inspections and conservation work. The museum's security system was designed to prevent unauthorized access, but it assumed that authorized personnel were acting legitimately. Elena had identified a window of opportunity during the museum's annual deep cleaning, when artworks were temporarily removed from display for maintenance. During this period, she would have several hours of unsupervised access to the painting, ostensibly to conduct a routine condition assessment. The switch would have to be executed with perfect precision. Elena had practiced the procedure dozens of times, timing every movement to ensure that the painting would be out of its frame for the minimum possible time. She had even created detailed maps of the museum's security camera blind spots and had calculated the exact timing needed to avoid detection. But Elena's plan went beyond simply stealing the painting. She had also developed an elaborate scheme for legitimizing her ownership of the stolen artwork. Through a network of contacts in the underground art market, she had created a false provenance that would allow her to eventually discover the painting and claim it as a legitimate acquisition. The false provenance involved creating fake documentation showing that the painting had been sold by Van Gogh to a private collector in 1889, had remained in that family's collection for over a century, and was now being offered for sale by the collector's heirs. Elena had spent months creating authentic-looking 19th century documents, aging paper and ink to match the period, and even establishing false genealogical records for the fictional collector's family. Elena's ultimate goal was not just to own the Van Gogh, but to eventually donate it to a museum under her own name, cementing her legacy as one of the great art patrons of her generation. The irony was perfect. She would be celebrated for giving the art world a masterpiece that she had actually stolen from the art world. As Elena put the finishing touches on her replica, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had started as an idealistic young woman who believed in the power of art to inspire and educate. But years of watching the art world's corruption and elitism had transformed her into someone who believed that the only way to truly appreciate art was to possess it completely. The Starry Night Over the Rain represented everything Elena loved about Van Gogh's work: the bold colors, the emotional intensity, the way he captured not just the visual appearance of a scene but its spiritual essence. For too long, this masterpiece had been trapped behind museum glass, viewed by millions but truly understood by few. Elena believed that she was not stealing the painting, but liberating it. In her private collection, it would be appreciated by someone who truly understood its significance, rather than being gawked at by tourists who spent 30 seconds looking at it before moving on to the next attraction. The night before the planned theft, Elena stood in her workshop, looking at the completed replica. Even she had to admit that it was perfect, indistinguishable from the original in every way that mattered. Tomorrow, she would make history by executing the most sophisticated art theft ever attempted. But Elena had no idea that her activities had already been detected by someone who understood her methods better than she realized. Dr. James Morrison, the museum's director of security and a former FBI art crimes investigator, had been quietly monitoring Elena's behavior for months, waiting for her to make her move. The hunter was about to become the hunted, but Elena Rossi was far from finished. Her greatest challenge and her most brilliant deception was yet to come. The morning of March 15th dawned gray and overcast. Perfect weather for what Elena Rossi considered to be her masterpiece performance. The Whitmore Museum's annual deep cleaning had begun the previous week, and today was scheduled for the comprehensive maintenance of the European paintings, including the Starry Night Over the Rain. Elena arrived at the museum at 6:30 a.m., 2 hours before the building would open to the public. As senior curator, her early arrival was not unusual. She often came in early to work on research or handle administrative tasks without interruption. What was unusual was the large conservation case she wheeled in through the staff entrance, a case that contained her perfect replica of the Van Gogh masterpiece. "Morning, Dr. Rossi," called out Marcus, the security guard who had been working the early shift for over a decade. "Another conservation project, routine condition assessment," Elena replied with a smile, her voice betraying none of the nervous energy that was coursing through her body. "The Van Gogh needs its annual checkup before we finalize the insurance renewal." Elena made her way through the familiar corridors of the museum, past sleeping galleries that in a few hours would be filled with visitors from around the world, the European paintings wing was temporarily closed to the public, with signs directing visitors to other exhibitions while maintenance was being conducted. The security system in the European paintings wing was the most sophisticated in the museum, with motion sensors, pressure plates, and environmental monitors that tracked everything from temperature and humidity to the chemical composition of the air around each artwork. But Elena had spent months studying these systems, and she knew exactly how to work within their parameters. The starry night over the Rhône hung in the wing's central gallery, illuminated by carefully calibrated LED lights that brought out the painting's brilliant blues and yellows. Elena had looked at this painting thousands of times over the past 15 years. But today, she saw it differently, not as a museum piece, but as her prize. Elena began by following her normal routine for condition assessments, photographing the painting from multiple angles and making notes about its current state. To any observer, she appeared to be conducting a routine curatorial examination, but every movement was calculated, every action designed to provide cover for what she was about to do. The critical moment came when Elena needed to remove the painting from its frame for what appeared to be a closer examination of the canvas edges. This was a legitimate part of conservation work, but it was also the moment when she would make the switch. Elena had practiced this procedure dozens of times in her workshop. Using a replica frame and mock security system, she knew that she would have exactly 12 minutes between removing the original painting and replacing it before the security system's sensors would detect an anomaly in the gallery's environmental conditions. Working with the precision of a surgeon, Elena carefully lifted the original Van Gogh from its frame and placed it on a padded examination table. For a moment, she simply stared at the masterpiece, overwhelmed by the realization that she was holding one of the world's most valuable paintings in her hands. The original was even more beautiful up close than Elena had remembered. Van Gogh's brushstrokes seemed to pulse with life, and the colors had a depth and vibrancy that no reproduction could fully capture. For a brief moment, Elena almost reconsidered her plan. This painting belonged to the world, not to any individual. But then she remembered all the times she had watched wealthy collectors bid millions for artworks that would disappear into private collections, never to be seen by the public again. She thought about the museum board members who treated art as investment assets rather than cultural treasures. Her resolve hardened. Elena opened her conservation case and carefully removed her replica. Even in the museum's sophisticated lighting, the forgery was indistinguishable from the original. Every brushstroke, every color variation, every crack and imperfection had been perfectly reproduced. The switch took less than 3 minutes. Elena placed the original Van Gogh in her conservation case and mounted the replica in the frame. She then spent several more minutes photographing the replica and making notes, maintaining the appearance of conducting a routine examination. As Elena worked, she was acutely aware of the security cameras that monitored every corner of the gallery, but she had studied their positions and angles carefully, and she knew that her actions would appear completely normal to anyone reviewing the footage. She was simply a curator doing her job. The most dangerous moment came when Elena had to transport the original painting out of the museum. The conservation case was designed to shield artworks from environmental damage, but it also blocked the security sensors that might detect the painting's unique chemical signature. Elena's heart raced as she wheeled the case through the museum's corridors, past security guards and maintenance workers who had no idea that she was carrying out the theft of the century. Every step felt like an eternity, but Elena forced herself to maintain her normal pace and demeanor. "Finished already?" Marcus asked as Elena approached the staff exit. "Just the preliminary assessment," Elena replied. "I'll be back later this week to complete the full examination." As Elena loaded the conservation case into her car, she felt a mixture of exhilaration and terror. She had actually done it. She had stolen one of the world's most famous paintings from one of the world's most secure museums, and no one suspected a thing. But Elena's work was far from over. The theft was only the first phase of her plan. Now she had to ensure that the crime would never be discovered. Over the following weeks, Elena maintained her normal routine at the museum, conducting tours, meeting with donors, and overseeing exhibitions. She paid special attention to the starry night over the Rhône, making sure that her replica continued to pass casual inspection. The replica was so perfect that even Elena sometimes had to remind herself that it wasn't the original. Visitors continued to flock to see the painting. Art critics praised its beauty in their reviews, and even other curators and conservators who examined it closely found nothing suspicious. But Elena knew that her greatest test would come during the painting's next comprehensive authentication, scheduled for the following year. Museums routinely subjected their most valuable works to advanced scientific analysis, including X-ray imaging, infrared spectroscopy, and chemical analysis of paint samples. Elena had prepared for this challenge by ensuring that her replica would pass even the most sophisticated tests. She had used pigments with the same chemical composition as Van Gogh's original materials, had aged the canvas using controlled environmental exposure, and had even replicated the underlying layers of paint that would be visible in X-ray analysis. Most importantly, Elena had access to the museum's authentication records for the original painting, which meant she knew exactly what results the scientific tests should produce. Her replica had been specifically designed to generate identical results. 3 months after the theft, Elena received the news she had been waiting for. A wealthy private collector had expressed interest in acquiring a Van Gogh for his collection and was willing to pay top dollar for an authenticated work. Through her network of contacts in the underground art market, Elena began the process of introducing her Van Gogh to potential buyers. The false provenance Elena had created was a masterpiece of deception in itself. According to the fabricated documents, the painting had been purchased directly from Van Gogh by a French industrialist named Henri Dubois in 1889. The Dubois family had kept the painting in their private collection for over a century, and it was now being offered for sale by Henry's great-great-granddaughter, who needed money to settle estate taxes. Elena had spent months creating the supporting documentation for this story, including fake family records, forged letters from Van Gogh to Dubois, and even false entries in period art catalogs. She had also established a false identity as Marie Dubois, complete with a Swiss bank account and a carefully constructed personal history. The beauty of Elena's plan was that it didn't require her to sell the painting immediately. She could wait years or even decades before bringing it to market, allowing time for any investigation into its theft to fade away. In the meantime, she could enjoy private ownership of one of the world's greatest masterpieces. Elena had converted a climate-controlled room in her apartment into a private gallery where she could display the Van Gogh. Every morning, she would spend time alone with the painting, studying its brushstrokes and colors in a way that no museum visitor ever could. She felt a connection to Van Gogh's artistic vision that she had never experienced when the painting was behind museum glass. But Elena's greatest satisfaction came from the knowledge that she had outsmarted the entire art establishment. Museum directors, security experts, and law enforcement officials all believed that the Starry Night over the Rhône was safely hanging in the Whitmore Museum, never suspecting that they were looking at a forgery. 6 months after the theft, received an unexpected visitor at the museum. Dr. James Morrison, the director of security, asked to meet with her privately in her office. "Elena," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk, "I need to ask you about the Van Gogh." Elena's heart began racing, but she forced herself to remain calm. "What about it?" "I've been reviewing our security footage from the past few months," Morrison continued, "and I've noticed some interesting patterns in your interactions with the painting." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. Had she made a mistake? Had Morrison detected something suspicious in her behavior? "I'm not sure what you mean," Elena said carefully. Morrison smiled, but there was something unsettling about his expression. "Elena, I know what you did. The question is, what are we going to do about it?" Elena's mind raced as she tried to assess the situation. Was Morrison bluffing? Did he have evidence? Was this a trap? "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Elena said, trying to buy time to think. "No misunderstanding," Morrison replied. "I know you switched the paintings. I know you have the original Van Gogh, and I know about your false provenance scheme." Elena felt the walls closing in around her. After months of perfect execution, had her plan finally unraveled. But Morrison's next words surprised her completely. "The question is," he said, "are you willing to cut me in on the deal?" Elena stared at Morrison in shock. Was the museum's director of security actually proposing to become her partner in crime? "I don't know what you're talking about," Elena said, still not ready to admit anything. Morrison laughed. "Elena, I've been investigating art crimes for 20 years. I know a sophisticated operation when I see one. Your plan is brilliant, but you made one mistake. You assumed you were the only one in this museum who understood how to steal art without getting caught." As Elena processed Morrison's words, she realized that her perfect crime had just become infinitely more complicated. She was no longer a lone wolf operating in secret. She now had a partner who knew her secret and wanted a share of her prize. The question was, could she trust James Morrison? Or was this the beginning of the end of her carefully constructed plan? Elena Rossi stared at Dr. James Morrison across her office desk, her mind racing as she tried to process this unexpected turn of events. The museum's director of security, a former FBI art crimes investigator with an impeccable reputation, sitting calmly in her office, claiming to know about her theft of the Van Gogh, and proposing to become her partner? "You're bluffing," Elena said finally. Though her voice lacked conviction, Morrison reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "Am I?" He opened the folder and spread out a series of photographs and documents. "These are surveillance photos of you entering your apartment building with the conservation case on March 15th. This is a chemical analysis of paint residue found on your clothing that matches the specific pigment composition of Van Gogh's original materials. And this," he said, placing a final document on the desk, "is a complete dossier on your false identity as Marie Dubois." Elena felt her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. Morrison had evidence that could destroy her life and send her to prison for decades, but his calm demeanor and talk of partnership suggested that he had something else in mind. "What do you want?" Elena asked quietly. "I want what you want," Morrison replied. "I want to own great art, and I want to be wealthy enough to enjoy it properly. The difference is that I'm realistic about the challenges we're facing." Morrison leaned back in his chair and began explaining what Elena didn't know about her situation. "Your theft was brilliant, but it wasn't undetected. The museum's new AI-powered security system flagged anomalies in the environmental data from the European painting's wing on March 15th. The changes were subtle. Microscopic variations in air composition, tiny fluctuations in electromagnetic fields, but they were enough to trigger an investigation." Elena's heart sank. She had been so focused on the visible security measures that she hadn't considered the possibility of an AI-powered analysis of environmental data. "I've been covering for you," Morrison continued. "I've been filing reports that attribute the anomalies to equipment malfunctions and environmental fluctuations. But that won't work indefinitely. Eventually, someone is going to take a closer look at your replica." "The replica is perfect," Elena protested. "It will pass any authentication test." Morrison smiled grimly. "Elena, you're thinking like an art historian, not like a security expert. Yes, your replica is visually perfect, and it might even pass chemical analysis. But there are other ways to authenticate a painting that you haven't considered." Morrison pulled out another document, a technical report that Elena didn't recognize. "This is an analysis of the painting's electromagnetic signature. Every painting has a unique electromagnetic field created by the interaction of its materials, the way they've aged, and even the specific environmental conditions it's been exposed to over time. Your replica has a different electromagnetic signature than the original." Elena felt a chill of fear. She had spent years perfecting the visual and chemical aspects of her forgery, but she had never considered electromagnetic authentication. "How long do we have?" Elena asked. "The museum is planning a comprehensive authentication of all major works next month as part of an insurance review," Morrison said. "When they run the electromagnetic analysis, they'll discover that the painting is a fake. After that, it's just a matter of time before the investigation leads back to you." Elena realized that her perfect crime was about to become a perfect disaster, but Morrison's presence in her office suggested that he had a solution. "What are you proposing?" Elena asked. Morrison's plan was audacious in its simplicity. Rather than trying to cover up the theft indefinitely, he proposed that they stage a recovery of the stolen painting that would make them both heroes, while allowing Elena to keep the original. "Here's what we're going to do," Morrison explained. "In 2 weeks, I'm going to discover evidence that the painting in our gallery is a fake. I'll launch an investigation that will reveal that the original was stolen months ago and replaced with a sophisticated replica. The investigation will lead to a fictional criminal organization that specializes in high-end art theft." Elena listened with growing amazement as Morrison outlined his plan. The fictional criminal organization would be based on real art theft, rings that Morrison had investigated during his FBI career, making the story believable to law enforcement and insurance investigators. Meanwhile, Morrison continued, "You'll be working with me to track down the stolen painting. We'll follow a carefully constructed trail of evidence that will lead us to a warehouse in New Jersey, where the painting will be recovered along with several other stolen artworks." "But how do we explain having the original to recover?" Elena asked. Morrison smiled. "That's the beautiful part. The original will never be recovered. What we'll recover is another replica, one that's good enough to fool casual inspection, but not sophisticated enough to pass detailed authentication. We'll claim that the criminals were planning to sell this replica as the original, but we caught them before they could complete the transaction." Elena began to understand the brilliance of Morrison's plan. The museum would get back what they believed was their original Van Gogh. The insurance company would be satisfied that the theft had been solved, and Elena would keep the real painting, while being celebrated as the hero who helped recover it. "What about the electromagnetic signature?" Elena asked. "I'll make sure that the authentication equipment malfunctions during the recovery process," Morrison said. "By the time it's repaired, the painting will be back in the gallery, and any discrepancies will be attributed to damage suffered during the theft." But Morrison's plan came with a price. "I want 50% of the proceeds when you eventually sell the painting," he said, "and I want to be involved in any future operations you might be planning." Elena realized that she had no choice but to accept Morrison's terms. Without his help, she would be arrested within weeks and would spend the rest of her life in prison. With his help, she could not only escape punishment, but could continue her career as both a respected curator and a master art thief. "Agreed," Elena said. Over the following 2 weeks, Morrison and Elena worked together to implement their plan. Morrison used his security access to plant evidence of the fictional art theft ring, creating a trail of false documents and forged communications that would lead investigators to the predetermined conclusion. Elena, meanwhile, created the second replica that would be recovered during the staged operation. This replica was intentionally flawed, good enough to fool casual observers, but obviously fake to anyone who examined it closely. The flaws would support the story that the criminals had been planning to sell an inferior forgery as the original. The discovery of the theft was perfectly orchestrated. Morrison announced that routine security analysis had revealed anomalies suggesting that the Van Gogh might be a forgery. Emergency authentication tests confirmed that the painting in the gallery was indeed a replica, triggering a massive investigation. Elena played her part perfectly, expressing shock and outrage at the theft while working closely with Morrison. To investigate the crime, she provided expert analysis of the replica, identifying the specific techniques used by the forgers and helping to build a profile of the criminal organization responsible. The investigation led exactly where Morrison had planned. Following a trail of carefully planted evidence, law enforcement traced the theft to a warehouse in New Jersey, where they found the second replica, along with several other stolen artworks that Morrison had acquired through his law enforcement contacts. The recovery operation was a media sensation. Elena and Morrison were hailed as heroes who had solved one of the most sophisticated art thefts in history. The museum celebrated the return of their Van Gogh. Insurance companies praised the effectiveness of the investigation, and law enforcement officials used the case as an example of successful cooperation between museums and security agencies. But the greatest triumph was that no one suspected the truth. The Starry Night Over the Rhône remained in Elena's private collection, while the museum displayed the second replica, believing it to be the recovered original. 6 months after the recovery, Elena and Morrison began planning their next operation. They had proven that they could steal, replace, and recover masterpieces without detection. The art world was full of targets, and they now had the perfect system for acquiring them. Elena's apartment had been transformed into a private museum containing some of the world's greatest masterpieces. She had Van Gogh's The Starry Night Over the Rhône, a Monet water lily painting recovered from a fictional theft in Boston, and a Picasso sketch that had been damaged during a staged break-in at a private gallery and replaced with a replica. Theft followed the same pattern. Elena would create a perfect replica, Morrison would arrange for the switch, and then they would stage a recovery operation that returned a deliberately flawed forgery to the original owners. The art world celebrated their success in recovering stolen masterpieces, never realizing that the real paintings were hanging in Elena's private collection. But Elena's greatest satisfaction came not from the monetary value of her collection, but from the knowledge that she had achieved something unprecedented in the history of art crime. She had created a system that allowed her to steal masterpieces while being celebrated as a hero for recovering them. 5 years after the original Van Gogh theft, Elena stood in her private gallery, surrounded by some of the world's greatest artworks. She had become one of the most respected figures in the art world, known for her expertise in authentication and her success in recovering stolen masterpieces. Morrison had proven to be the perfect partner. His law enforcement background provided the credibility and access they needed, while Elena's curatorial expertise ensured that their operations remained undetected. Together, they had revolutionized art theft, creating a system that was not just undetectable, but actually enhanced their reputations in the legitimate art world. As Elena looked at The Starry Night Over the Rhône, she reflected on Van Gogh's famous quote, "I dream of painting, and then I paint my dream." Elena had dreamed of owning the world's greatest masterpieces, and she had found a way to make that dream reality. The perfect crime wasn't just about stealing art without getting caught. It was about stealing art while being celebrated for protecting it. Elena Rossi had achieved something that no criminal in history had ever accomplished. She had made her victims grateful for being robbed, but Elena's greatest masterpiece wasn't any of the paintings. Hanging on her walls, it was the elaborate deception that allowed her to live as both the world's most successful art thief and one of its most respected protectors. She had painted herself into the perfect life, and no one would ever suspect that the canvas was a forgery. The end disclaimer. This story is completely fictional and created for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real people, museums, or events is purely coincidental. The methods described should never be attempted in real life.